The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis, on infogov.net. On today's The Strategy of Information, Nick Inglis talks with 10xTS founder and CEO, Michael Hiles. Michael Hiles lives on the cutting edge of the information profession. A serial entrepreneur with a deep track record of success, he's been building his latest venture, 10xTS, in the background for the past 2 years. None of us knew exactly what he and his team were building. Today he shares that what he's been building brings the information profession squarely into the world of blockchain. Today we're talking blockchain and how the information profession will exist in our very near future, with 10xTS founder and CEO, Michael Hiles on The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis, on infogov.net.
In our last episode, we talked about the history of the information profession with Bob Larrivee. Today, we move to the forefront of technology. Having an accurate account of the people who have created, edited, viewed, and modified information, it's been an ongoing challenge. Without an absolute factual understanding of how a piece of information has been transformed over its life cycle, it becomes increasingly difficult to establish accountability in those times when things go wrong. That's why ARMA's generally accepted record-keeping principles, organizing principles for records managers, it recognizes immutability or unchangeability as an important records management principle. Immutability can only occur when we know for certain that a record has not changed. Our current systems offer that to us, but with varying degrees of confidence. All of that is set to change with the advent of blockchain in the information profession and the promise of an immutable ledger underlying information systems. This new way of storing information replaces our traditional databases, and its promise has been written about by experts of all stripes. What hasn't happened yet, though, is actually having the systems that support this new technology advancement. And that is set to change with our next guest. For the past 2 years, Michael Hiles and his team have been secretly and quietly building something with some solid venture capital behind them that they're now ready to share. Today, you're going to hear what Michael Hiles and his team have been building. The first blockchain-based system in the records and information space. We're at the cusp of a brand new era in the information profession, and we're about to hear about it next on The Strategy of Information in my conversation with 10xTS founder and CEO, Michael Hiles. Michael, welcome to The Strategy of Information. You are one of the folks that I look to when I'm trying to figure out where the information market is heading next. Because inevitably, you're already there, waiting for the market to catch up and ready to capitalize. You have built a solid team that has been working in secret now for what feels like years, and I think actually has been years, with some solid venture capital money backing you. Now, I've been excited to hear what you've been building behind the scenes these past, few years, and you're in the process of launching right now. Michael, welcome to the program. Can you share with our audience what you've been working on and what you're in the process of launching?
Thank you. That was quite the intro. I try not to go by my alter ego, Shingy, the futurist. Do you remember Shingy? He had a cool haircut.
I don't remember.
Yeah, he was
that a
AOL's
thing?
futurist, so he didn't do a very good job, I don't think.
Oh,
remember,
no, I
he was
do
the Asian
remember
guy
that.
with like the really punk, radical anime
he had
hair.
a unique
yes.
look.
Skater punk kind of thing. So anyway, I don't have any hair, so thanks for having me on, Nick. I appreciate it. I always love hanging out with you, man.
You're awesome. And we've known each other for years. You were out in front of the SharePoint market when all of that was coming to the fore. You were ready for that big change, and I see you're positioned now for what I think is the next big jump.
Yeah, SharePoint was cool. I've always been since I started coding as a kid on mainframes, it was all business objects all the time. I didn't mind, binary hardware device driver development and getting down into the weeds of interrupts and, gate channels. But, the business object data has always been sort of my thing. And then the web came along. And as you know, as a web early guy, in terms of development, the shift that went on in that era really enforced a lot of information governance standardization as it transitioned from the old school of business objects, business records to business objects to web services, and now blockchain, right? I mean, that's kind of where we're at.
Well, that's where you are. Yeah. And I think you're positioned ahead of pretty much everyone else in the space. I think everyone else is scrambling now to try and figure out how to port their existing solutions and make them blockchain or blockchainify them. But you've actually started from the ground up. What is it that you're doing with blockchain, and what do you think that means to the next generation of apps or dApps?
Well, let's back up and be sure that we define what a blockchain is for folks, and because even the technologists don't necessarily agree on terminology for things. There's several attributes to what constitutes a blockchain. Most people think of blockchain in terms of the technology that powers Bitcoin. However, just because Bitcoin came along didn't mean that we weren't hanging out doing token ring networks. And I mean, even in later iterations, the idea of decentralized networks of data object sharing, such as Napster, right? So just think of it in terms of the hash and the binary of an MP3 file being replaced with a cryptographic hash that is a marker for a transaction. And so blockchain becomes a ledger of records, transactional records, where there are some rules around who gets to write to the ledger. In Bitcoin's example, it's miners that are trying to discover transactions by solving cryptographic mathematical algorithmic problems with massive computing power, right? Other blockchains, it's a governance-based structure where you own enough of the internal blockchain token to vote yourself into block-producing authority, right? So staking type of a scenario. But ultimately, it comes down to, it's a glorified Excel spreadsheet. I hate to make it demystify it that way, but that's literally what it is. It's a ledger.
Well, I think
so.
I mean, and let's pretend for a moment that I've had some exposure to blockchain, which is true, but somehow I missed everything except for the discussion on Bitcoin. So I know, in my mind, I've heard about Bitcoin, and I know that it's powered by something called the blockchain, but I don't quite understand, what that means beyond this cryptocurrency. What are the business implications of blockchain, and why is this different?
Wow, that's a good question because it covers a lot of territory.
Loaded.
Yeah, there's a lot to unwind on that one. So why this is different from traditional data is that it's what I call it's an evolution of consortia-based computing that we did in the 70s and 80s with mainframe consortium, right? You had a business processing center where a bunch of organizations chipped in, many times had a formalized association, right? Very common in healthcare, right? But mainframes were so many millions and millions and millions of dollars to acquire and operate. And so you would timeshare the computing resource, and as a developer, you'd take your punch cards or your reels down to the computing processing center and load the program up onto the drive, and the processor would run your program, and you would get this nice stack of green bar, big giant impact printer, wasn't even dot matrix in the beginning, right? It was typewriter keys, right? And and you'd get your output, your report that was generated, and a nice little invoice slid in under the rubber band of your output report for how much processing time that you consumed on the network.
Yeah.
Blockchain is very similar to that in the sense that it's a decentralized protocol-based data resource. It's a system of record, right? But in the case of a public cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, for example, in order to maintain that computing resource, lots of actors read the original Satoshi white paper. There was a cabal of nerdy cypherpunk cryptographers that had spent a lot of time discussing over the course of many previous years around electronic money and ideas around, how do you defeat the double spend problem that's inherent to traditional RDB-based data electronic money structures. And so this anonymous person to this day, some people think he's, an NSA operative or who knows, we don't know who it is. Some people claim to be now Satoshi. I severely reject that.
There are multiple.
Yes. It blows my mind that someone can go and take an open source project and then file a copyright on the original paper saying, I am the guy that originally wrote this. It's kind of stupid, but be that as it may.
I mean, the fact that they're putting in a claim and a copyright sort of lets you know that they're not, because the original intent was that it was open source and available freely to everyone.
That's exactly right. That's why it's mind blowing for all these corporations trying to get blockchain patents, right? Which, that's besides the point. But so you have this white paper that then a year later turned into an open source project of developers building a protocol based network server client scenario that they could download the mining software and fire it up on a server and thus talk to the rest of the entire network, be able to ingest potential transactions, run the math, determine if they're true or not, and then ultimately be rewarded financially, right? There's built-in payment scenario, gas, mining, mining for Bitcoin, right? You get something. Go ahead.
No, and that's not uncommon. It's an asset much like gold or diamonds, where you would mine it and it costs time to mine.
Yes.
If you were mining diamonds, you'd be expending capital, human capital, mining for what is rare. But for blockchain, you're using your computing resources, spending the computing resources, and eventually solving cryptographic challenges, and you are rewarded with Bitcoin in doing so.
That's right.
So it's not uncommon to the physical things that we do around assets that have monetary value.
That's right, because computing resource data is an asset, right? And maintenance of that data is clearly a value producing asset. So some people argue, well, it's not worth anything. It's only worth, whatever the energy consumption is, which is a lot. So I guess it's worth a lot, right?
Yeah. And it becomes more because the challenges are becoming more difficult.
That is correct. The algorithmically, the Bitcoin network is designed to become progressively more difficult, and thus slowing down the number of Bitcoins that are mined. We know that 21 million are available on a maximum basis, but that's still going to take several more decades to fully mine it out. But then the gas will still continue to trade, because when I send you Bitcoin, I'm paying an incremental fee on the network to incentivize the miner to include my transaction in the block. And so there's a self-sustaining financial incentivization that takes place for these independent actors to operate this glorified spreadsheet. Pretty important, right? Yeah. But it's an immutable spreadsheet. And that's really the distinction, that because of the cryptography and the hashing and the time stamping and the proofing of the notarial sort of function, the non-legal notarial, but just, I'm time stamping the proof of data that this transaction occurred. Here was the actors, the accounts, the incremental transaction, the data, the metadata about the transaction. that becomes immutable and chiseled into rock, essentially.
Yeah.
It can't be changed.
And you're taking that exactly, and you're taking that underlying technology, the concept, and you're applying it in some interesting ways. And we're not talking specifically currency, but there's an information angle here. Can you explain how the information angle ties into that conceptual model
Sure.
of blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. The best way is to explain the story of how I arrived at what I'm doing.
Perfect.
When other types of cryptocurrencies were being developed, one of the primary use cases of adoption early on was to use a token as a form of unit of account or value as a crowdfunding project. These are not simple, these are not inexpensive projects at scale. And the traditional venture model, especially in consideration of the very nascent tip of spear nature of even the technology, there's no foreseeable business use case for a very long time. So it's just pure research and development. How do engineers, open source, GitHub communities, right? How do they obtain the funding that they need to finance these efforts? And so you had the initial coin offering phenomenon, the ICO is what it was called. And it ran the gamut from, we're just going to sell people these magic bean tokens in advance of the existence of the network, thus tripping Securities Exchange Commission regulations of what constitutes an investment contract or a security versus, what in a proper product scope would be a very similar to the predecessor concept of a token, like the actual security token. You've got an RSID for your bank account. I have mine sitting right here on my desk, right? How long have we had these things? This is for my bank. This is not a LedgerX storing Bitcoin. This is, for me to log into my checking account online. And so,
and that's been around for
decades,
20, 25 years.
Yeah, that's not new. None of this is new, right? It's just a rehash of already, but like most innovation and technological development, I'm old, I got gray hair. I've been through enough of these tech cycles that there's literally nothing new under the sun. It's just a rehash of old concepts with better, smaller, faster, cheaper, something in the interim, right? So as projects started to try to generate and form capital to pay for these things, the recognition was this could be an interesting application of the technology to solve problems in financial services, capital markets, these highly regulated industries. But the way that they were going about it was sort of backwards in my mind, right? From a couple of fronts. Number one, they were working to sort of let's build the project and build the network out first, and then we'll figure out how to leverage the network to bring users onto the network, thus triggering the network economic effect of what's going to ultimately create value for the network, right? So network economic effect is a very important calculation for any software, SaaS. It's basically the value of the network is proportionate to the number of people actually using the network. Like the invention of the telephone, right? Yeah. When Alexander, when the first phone was invented, it was still pretty worthless, right? It was only when the second phone was created and connected to the first phone, then did that makings of a network have value, and then, Verizon. So,
and onward.
Right. So the idea of building this generic network first and then finding a use case felt to me like a seasoned old dog entrepreneur, like, well, we've created a hammer, let's run around looking for nails. And that's an engineering sort of, I guess, an engineer first sort of approach to entrepreneurship. Sometimes work.
And some to be fair, some of them found a nail. Some of them actually pulled it off and found a nail, but it's a small percentage of the overall startups that entered the space.
That's right. So then the second flaw was the idea that blockchain, Bitcoin, all of these things are what I call trust technologies, right? It's a trust network. The idea that now I'm using this technology to create this magic bean digital token thingy on a network, somehow or another that represents a share in a fund or a share in a company or some other thing, right? And I always challenge the notion.
There's an asset.
Yeah, something, right? There's a fractional unit of account that represents some other, I don't want to get into Western philosophy stuff, but the epistemology of what constitutes existence, right? This legal notion, right? And this is where the legal beagles, like the attorneys, like love to get involved in all this stuff because it, they like to debate the phenomenology and the epistemology of the existence of stuff, right? And how do we use language, right? John 1, verse 1, right? In the beginning was the word, right? And creation. Boom.
And our language, our language is probably wrong for this type of technology right now, because I was reading some of the stuff that you wrote in preparation, and there was a line in one of the things, and I can't remember which of the resources that I read it from, but you said something around like the policies and the regulations around this are written for assets that are created on the carcasses of dead trees.
Yes.
And I loved the language that you used for that explanation.
Well, that's my half.
Now
that's my half attempt at ESG, right? We want to be socially conscious. So squirting ink on parchment seems to still be a anachronistic form of communication. So.
Yeah, but now the asset is a digital asset. Yep. There is no dead tree carcass. So it changes it.
Yes. And that's the difficult thing, because we still produce artifacts of legal workflows whenever I'm creating a corporation, for example. It's the genesis of a new entity. I'm essentially birthing an asset to a degree, right?
Yeah.
Well, how does that happen? Well, I call up my attorney and I say, hey, can you file an LLC or a Delaware C Corp or whatever? And he produces voluminous stack of dead tree carcasses, right? And I sign them and then they go somewhere, right? Into his document management system or something. But
and you hope that that's secure. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that, that becomes sort of the proof of existence, along with some form of recordation by the official jurisdictional government entities that oversee such things, secretaries of state, Securities Exchange Administration, like whoever that you have to file your requisite forms in triplicate with the proper folks. But this cuts back to the idea of trust technology. How we've handled trust in the past has either been through some form of jurisdictionally required, intermediary, right? I'm vouching for this information. A notary, a broker-dealer, right? Some intermediary, right? The provability now is on their shoulders. But the interesting conundrum is the whole idea of automating trust mathematically, right? So how do, and this was always my challenge to the early, guys that wanted to turn shares of companies into, or, units of funds, LP, limited partnerships, into these magic beans for the purpose of capital formation, funding. How do you prove that magic bean right there on that network actually is a share of stock? And they say, well, it's in the contracts. That's cool. Where are the contracts? Remember that stack of paperwork that's at the law firm? So now we get into the not so innovated, disrupted things that you're very well familiar with around the idea of e-discovery and ESI and, like all of these traditional information governance and records management topics. So how do you create a systematic, easy approach to bridging the gap between those existing records with some form of oracle or outside of the blockchain network attachment in a mathematically provable way to this volume of traditional records. So now I can literally attach the legal documentation, the shareholder subscription agreement, the transfer agent recordation, whatever, right? Whatever's part of these processes, that we can attach those associated workflow documents, logging, governance, ACL lists, like literally, how do you attach all of that immutably to what is ultimately an immutable record on the spreadsheet, right? That can't be changed.
Yeah.
It'll be updated, right? But I can't go back and I can't change a single character in that original private placement memorandum without altering the mathematical hash of the binary of that original document, right?
Which is essentially impossible.
It's completely impossible. Yeah. Now, you can argue, well, at some point, quantum computers are going to come online and, there'll be different forms of cryptography and, Great thing is people a lot smarter than me are solving that problem already. I think that there's, about 50 different new quantum-proof cryptographic methods under research by NIST. They've had grants and open calls for projects for the past several years on advancing cryptography and math as a whole. And, all this stuff's a product of their previous cryptographic efforts. So I think they're already in the process of trying to solve that problem because, well, let's face it, the United States isn't the only country that has access to quantum computing technology.
And frankly, when we hit that point, our traditional systems have similar flaws and will likely face the same challenges that blockchain-based solutions would in that point in the distant future.
Yeah, I think, networks are upgradable. I mean, that's the thing is, while it is immutable, the previous record will always exist, right, in some way, because it's just a bunch of hash values. It's just a bunch of math and mathematical outputs on this global interconnected spreadsheet that they're certainly upgradable, right? We've heard about forks of different blockchains, and it's basically somebody says, I don't like your parameters. I want to change the parameters of this blockchain. I get enough block producers, miners together to all agree to change the software, and, well, we got a new one.
So the business application here, I'm trying to understand. So you've got this underlying technology. You can take it in multiple directions, not just in the information space, which is why you're a darling to the VCs. Can you explain why you're replicating the technology across multiple verticals? Which verticals are the ones that are the ones that you have essentially in your list of upcoming applications?
Yeah, I mean, obviously regulated industries represent the highest form of proofing and scrutiny at the top. So the segue between regulated industries and then their corresponding government regulators, right? Let's before we get down into the narrow verticals, let's think about that as a macro process, right? I have laws that in some way, shape, or form specify the rules of engagement about what I'm doing in this regulated space. And then there's requirements of record keeping, compliance officers, right? Somebody's responsible as a intermediary to review the activities of whatever the business is. And then ultimately, at some point, the assumption is because I'm registered or I'm licensed by this agency or regulator over here, DC or wherever, state capital, that at some point somebody's going to come along and knock on the door and say, hey, glad to talk to you. It's time for your annual examination. Or even worse, like, hey, we need records A, B, and C, and D because we think you did something naughty or someone involved did something naughty, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's yet to hit the legal community in a big way. I spend a lot of time talking to attorneys about these forms of recordation, like obviously Bitcoin and finance, DeFi, and all these forms of cryptocurrency-based financial companies, fintechs, and they're springing up all over the place. And what happens when we want to go and unwind the data around the forensic lookbacks on transaction A, B, and C regarding John and Jane Doe, two separate actors or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's this void presently because it's all still just a bunch of nearly indecipherable hashes on the network, right? And then the claim that somebody says, well, this this particular hash represents this contract or this shareholder agreement or whatever, right? So I think that there's a groundswell forming that's going to dump on the legal industry in a massive way, to the point that for the past several years, I've told a lot of my attorney friends and colleagues that if you're under age 40 as a JD or as a practicing attorney, and you better have some code. You better learn some form of code logic, because whether it's moving contractual logic to some form of smart contract computer program logic, or whether it's knowing what to ask for as part of a discovery for some civil or criminal procedure, it's like whoosh over their heads, right? They don't know. Buzzword, but how do I turn that into a deposition? So then we talk about the inefficiencies of, say, the examination process, right? And what's mind-blowing is if you take like one of the verticals that we work in, obviously, is financial services. Capital markets is one of our primary focuses, just because that's how we got into the space. We came in through capital formation and funds, and but the same rules apply to healthcare or supply chain logistics and customs. I mean, as you have like this massive broad sweeping applications, but that intersect between regulatory and private industry is really the interesting part. Is the same cybersecurity issues that we have today around the value chains of who's operating in the space. Like when somebody buys and sells a share of stock, well, typically you have the exchange, you have the broker dealer, you have DTCC, you have, the settlement, back office, you have potentially attorneys involved, accountants involved, tax preparers involved, the transfer agent. Each of those entities all have their own separate counsel and accounting, right? So what appears to be a two-party buy-sell transaction between you and I for a share of AAPL involves how many different layers of user, right? Somebody's intersecting with ostensibly the same common form of data, but it's not common data.
Yeah.
Right? Every single one of those entities has their own information systems stack to replicate that information, starting with, first name, last name, right? EIN, right? How many times is that replicated across all of the actors in some form in a single transaction? Right. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had a single source of truth, like a public record of systems that, much like Edgar, an actual single source of truth, much like Edgar, right? Yeah. Or a court clerk public record system, right? I mean, there is a single solitary official form of truth that an entry, a record, can only get in there via these well-defined requirements and procedures. Yeah. So then you go back to the spaces that we're working in, obviously capital markets, financial services. I'm real excited about the banking space right now because I think it's going to literally change the nature of what it means to be a custodian. So you have fiduciary custodian, but then you have, in our boring library sciences world, records custodian. What's the difference between those two? Do you know the difference between those two? A fiduciary custodian and a records custodian? The piece of paper hanging in the frame signed by the government hanging on the wall.
Yeah.
That's literally it.
It's the same process.
It's the same process. Yeah. It's literally the same data, but one is official. Yeah. One is just nerdy guys like us running cloud software and data applications, right?
Yeah.
So we saw
But you can apply the same solutions.
Correct. Doesn't matter.
To either. Yeah.
Literally, because it's all documents, metadata, workflow, logging, all the things that we're used to working in, even in, predating SharePoint, right? I mean, this is just, fundamental access control. Data definition and access control. Yeah. Back to common object brokerage and, I'm dating myself now. So... So we're real excited about banking. We're very excited about capital markets. Yeah. We think that there's some real disruptive potential around what it means to be a transfer agent, which is probably one of the most powerful yet unknown actors in securities and capital markets, because they are the official keeper of the cap table, right? They're the official scribe of who owns shares, to the point that whenever a company makes a dividend distribution, the transfer agent has incumbent responsibility to the government to find lost shareholders, right? You have this whole legal term called escheatment, and how do you keep track of who owns what and who's entitled to this dividend? And so we see that there's a big evolution underway right now, not only in banking and financial services, but across broker-dealers, exchanges. I mean, look at the emergence of these cryptocurrency exchanges. And once again, what's the difference between a cryptocurrency exchange and NASDAQ? Yeah. The government paper hanging on the wall, right? To the point that Coinbase has an ATS.
Dead tree carcasses.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Someone is in the official capacity to say that, your data is allowed to be actually that data, which seems like a shared fiction, but what do I know? I mean, humans, they're
But if you actually had it immutably in the blockchain, there's no longer a question. There's no longer the potential for someone to, move or put their finger on the scale in any way.
Yeah, up to the point to where the cypherpunks still they still assert that government is the ultimate intermediary, and can you replace government with math? That's like outside my pay grade. Maybe, I don't know. I mean,
not today.
No, because I've seen a lot of the arguments on crypto Twitter between all these blockchain people, and it's like, I don't know. Not.
I like math and all.
I love math, right? Math is so concrete and precise, and that's where, for me, the word side of it starts to break down because of the, call it the interpretive nature. But that's the interesting conundrum for the attorneys, right? Because they like the ambiguity of words, because then they can go argue based on what they want the outcome in court, right? Yeah. As opposed to engineer or mathematician, where some tiny little incremental precision changes, and now all of a sudden the nuclear bomb doesn't go off or whatever, right? I mean, we're very precise with our mathematics. So anyway.
So let's say I'm a person listening to this conversation right now, and I'm thoroughly intrigued. Maybe I've got a use case in mind. How do I work with you on this? How do I come to you and say, hey, here's this use case. I think it makes sense. Hiles, help me out. What does that look like?
Okay. So we have our commercialization strategy. I'm a channel guy. So when it comes to sales, I'm all about selling the channel and then leaving enough on the table for the channel partner. I guess it's my old Microsoft, upbringing, right? As a partner network.
The Microsoft way.
It's a pretty powerful Borg, in terms of reaching large audiences quickly through that channel network. So from a technology standpoint, our commercialization strategy as the tech company has been to establish partnerships with banking, transfer agent, broker-dealer, these kinds of entities. And then by helping improve their internal processes, they're able to offer transfer agent as a service, banking as a service, right? By embedding the tech, it's allowing them to enable their disruption. So at the core, I'm looking for ways to embed the technology, first and foremost, into vertical industry business models that are overdue for massive transformation, massive digital disruption. And, COVID, whatever you want to call it, the economic crunch is on to move towards an acceleration of digital transformation. And so that's who I'm looking for first and foremost. How to get a hold of us is really easy. 10xts, 10xts.com. And then you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Michael Hiles, Michaelhiles on Twitter. You can always reach out to me personally. So if you're in one of those vertical spaces, I'm going to move you to one of my channel partners. If you've got a vertical space that you're looking to bring a new game, then we'd like to potentially talk to you about commercialization strategies, partnering with us as industry partners.
And you're on this podcast right now, but you have your own podcast. Let's share the details with everybody. So if you're enjoying this conversation with Michael Hiles and you want to learn more, I urge you to pick up and subscribe to his podcast. Can you share the details?
Sure. Yeah, we have a podcast that we started last year around the fact that we were moving into commercialization in the banking and finance and capital markets sector. There's a whole bunch of collisions of different areas. There's an intersect between the technology, law, monetary policy, lots of these, confluence of these factors in that space. So my colleague, our senior vice president of 10xts, Jonathan Deaver, former legislator and attorney, spent time in as a banking regulator. We started a podcast called Digital Dollar, and so you can check us out. We're on all the major streaming networks, Anchor.fm or Spotify or Apple, but it's double me. So if you think I'm wordy and nerdy, add the legal side, because Jonathan's just techie enough and just economics enough. So, and then we usually bring in other nerdy economists, and so it's this confluence of finance, economics, tech, law. So we probably have like all 4 regular listeners. So
I was going to say, we got to pick up some more regular listeners because of the confluence of geekery. So if this is a conversation you're enjoying, you want the deep dive, you got to listen to Hiles.
Probably need to pull an Elon Musk on the Joe Rogan show before you plunk it into the iPhone. I don't know,
So I'm obviously someone who is still playing catch up to you in the blockchain space by like a long ways. You've got the expertise. What's something that, thinking of the audience, primarily information governance, information managers, records folks, data folks, what's something that you would love to impart to them? What is the thing that you want them to know about blockchain?
It's going to become part of your world as information governance professionals one way or another, whether you like it or not. So you need to have at least a cursory foundational understanding of the taxonomy and how some of these things actually work. Separately, I think to a large degree, information governance folks, and you already kind of see this in the industry a little bit, but they're going to move towards compliance as well, because the tactical lift of getting things done in this space is going to further and further be replaced by the math and the technology. And you'll see that evolution as e-discovery systems evolve, as record information management systems evolve, but then understanding that as these common information networks change, governance won't just be a siloed effort inside of a single organization, which makes it already hard enough, right? But it's going to be cross industry to a certain degree. Do I trust as organization A that organization B is giving me the right data? Is it conforming to these standards in such a way? And so having that common information framework is inevitable, and learning how these data networks operate as consortia and what their governance models are, the pros and cons, public cryptocurrency based networks versus private blockchains, right, which are true association based. You can only get past the velvet rope if we let you, sort of a scenario, which is completely different than the public space. And there's pros and cons of each, right? Some you have public cryptocurrency purists that are No, it's all got to be, in order for it to be provable and transparent, it's all got to be public. Like, well, that's great, but even from having worked in public record systems for courts, just because something's public record doesn't mean you widely put it on a neon sign and broadcast it to the world, which is why when you go do a record search on court clerk systems, that you'll see large blocks of redacted information like social security numbers and, addresses of people who have filed a restraining order, protection order complaint or whatever, right? So just because it's transparent doesn't mean it's good or that it's valid, right? That's the other recognition, is just because something is on a blockchain doesn't mean that it's true, right? And I think that in terms of auditing, the increase of effort and accountability of getting records onto a network will replace what is the normal, just run-of-the-mill annual interval audit, right, from an internal control standpoint, accounting standpoint. Because once it is on the blockchain, the presumption is every time something happens from heretofore, it's immutable, provable, mathematically verifiable. But it's the instance of when information goes to the blockchain, how do we know that that's true? And you see that in banking right now. Like you see that with, any of the financial services, because they don't know that somebody has a Bitcoin wallet with this public hash key, this hash address. They say that they're Michael Hiles, but I could have had it could have been my waywardly relative that asked me to create that blockchain wallet, Bitcoin wallet for them, because they're on the OFAC don't do business list because they like to hang out with Sudanese rebels or whatever, right? So, that provability is still very problematic.
The know your customer side.
Oh, you see very interesting policy recommendations coming out of Treasury around KYC, AML of, you as a regulated institution will not be allowed to send cryptocurrencies to uncustodied wallets, right? Otherwise, if you do, you have to also KYC the receiving wallet yourself and be responsible under OFAC and FACTA and all the, go to big boy prison if you get it wrong kind of scenarios, right? Yeah. So, those are kind of some of the broad level areas that I would say are going to really significantly impact the IG community and industry, and just understanding that at some point, everything will become some form of hash value on some network somewhere. And so getting comfortable with hashing binaries and records and the cryptography involved, and then ultimately it's old school protocol, right? It's operation asserts and like really nerdy stuff that I never thought I'd be doing anymore. But
well, this is, I'm taking that advice. I am myself trying to learn more about the underlying technologies that we've been discussing here. Michael, it has been an absolute pleasure. I wish you the absolute best. I know that you're going to continue to do some amazing things in this space and in all the spaces that you're currently playing in. 10XTS is the website that they should head to. Follow Michael at Michael Hiles on Twitter, and we'll have some additional information on the description for this episode. Michael, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me here on the Strategy of Information.
Likewise, man. I always love hanging out with you, Nick, even back at the old SharePoint conferences. So
heck yes.
Awesome. We'll have to get together here soon post-COVID, because my travel bug itch is killing me.
Same. I can't. Next time I'm in your neck of the woods in Cincinnati, we'll be having a drink, or if you head up my way into Providence or Boston area,
let's do it.
We'll chat.
Cool. Thanks.
It's great to see you. Great to talk with you, and we'll be in touch again soon. My brain hurts. How about yours? Things are about to get really interesting in the information profession if Michael Hiles and his team's vision of the future comes to pass, and I expect that with Hiles leading the charge, it will. What an exciting time to be a part of this wider information profession. I want to extend a huge thank you to Michael Hiles for joining, to share, and also a thank you to you for supporting the program by subscribing. You've already subscribed to the program, right? Go do that. Or you maybe have become a contributor and you're helping making programming like this possible. Thank you. Learn more about how you can support our program at infogov.net. In our next episode, we'll be talking SharePoint, Office 365, Teams, and process improvement with 17 time Microsoft MVP award winner and Thor Project's CEO, Rob Bogue. I'm excited for that conversation on the next episode of The Strategy of Information. Until then, I wish you the absolute best in all your information endeavors.
The Strategy of Information is listener and sponsor supported programming. Subscribing to the podcast is free, but supporters gain access to every episode in HD video, bonus episodes, the occasional extended interview, merch like tote bags and stickers, and so much more. Head to infogov.net to learn more about supporting the program. Corporate sponsorship options are now available for Season 2 of The Strategy of Information. The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis is available on podcast platforms everywhere and online at infogov.net. This has been a production of infogov.net.